At this time, we'd like to invite our panelists back up on stage. So Dan, Ken, Sonia, Nathan, if you could please come up and take your seats. All right, so we've got a few questions written down we want to hit individual people with. And then, as many of you recall, when you signed up for this event, we asked your name, your phone number, your emails, and then we also asked you a prompt, a question that you would ask these panelists, and those actually curated quite a few very good questions. So those were the basis for some of the questions we're going to ask here, and at the end, we're going to open it up to a Q&A session. Nathan, many of us have heard about your Cape Elizabeth affordable housing development, which you ultimately decided not to build. Can you take a few minutes and walk us through what happened there?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So my company decided to try something that we knew would be not easy and kind of risky, and try to do a significantly sized affordable housing project in Cape Elizabeth. So we put under contract a site right in the village center, right across the street from the Pond Cove shopping plaza, in a little commercial subdivision that was being done just to the right of the town hall. If you're familiar with Cape Elizabeth, if you were looking straight on at the town hall, it's just to the right. And we needed to get a zone change to do the density that we were proposing, a roughly 45 unit apartment complex. There was no zone anywhere in Cape Elizabeth that would allow a project of that size, unless you bought about 11 acres of land, which was obviously economically totally infeasible. So we looked for the place in town that had already allowed the most density, and it was then in the town center. But we still needed to increase the density to accomplish that project. And Cape Elizabeth does not have contract zoning, so you cannot in Cape Elizabeth rezone just a particular site. You have to rezone an entire zone. So we proposed a rezoning of that town center zone to allow for what we were proposing. And I'll just make this very brief and happy to answer questions. But the rezone that we proposed made it through the planning board with a positive recommendation on a 4-2 vote. And that was just advisory to the town council, because the town council in Cape Elizabeth makes decisions about rezones. So the town council then debated it and held many, many hearings and many public meetings, and we had many neighborhood meetings. And after all that, they voted 5-2 in favor of the zone change that we were proposing. But from the very beginning, there had been a very, very vocal group of citizens in Cape Elizabeth who were opposed to our project, and who came to every meeting, every planning board meeting, every town council meeting, marshaled their supporters, put ads in the paper, just doggedly opposing it. And they, the day after the town council approved the zone change that we needed, they announced that they were initiating a citizen-initiated referendum to overturn the new zone in the town center. And they needed about 900 signatures, which is about 1/10 of the number of registered voters in town, in order to put it on the ballot. And they quickly they needed to get those signatures, I think, in 30 days, if I'm not mistaken, and they got it in like 9 days. And we we saw kind of the handwriting on the wall, and it looked like there was significant opposition to our development. We also knew we would have to mount a political campaign now to try to overcome the citizens' veto that was being put on the ballot. And that was going to be very expensive and time-consuming and energy-consuming. So we ultimately made the decision to pull the plug on the project.
So, in a way, it was a bit of NIMBYism getting in the way of the development.
Yes.
And I'm saying that intentionally because I want to segue into a question for Sonia. So Sonia flew to Maine yesterday. Between PWM and her hotel, she saw a sign on the side of the road in Portland that said, "No on A, tenants are not property." It was done with spray paint. Many of you have probably seen them. Sonia, citizen-initiated referendums have become an incredibly politically divisive thing here in the city, where you have a city of roughly 70,000 people, a minority which are very politically active, and they're getting a lot of laws passed which are a hindrance to development through citizen-initiated referendum. What tactics have you seen employed in the past that have helped combat that?
Oh, okay, interesting. Well, one is state action. This is, Dan City, it's so great, you're building housing, but as you can see, not every city is like that, right? So the kind of thing that happened to your project, the state has the ability, many different ways to prevent that kind of thing from happening, right? Like if there had been a sufficient density bonus program or something, there wouldn't have needed to be a rezoning. Mm-hmm. That's what's great about density bonus. That's the direction that it can go. So that's the number one thing. The other thing is moving your elections to a normal time, right? The first Tuesday in November. Just the first Tuesday in November. Obviously, like even years are better because it lines up with bigger elections, but having elections like in May or February when literally no one expects it, they haven't voted at that time, that's really catastrophic. And the nice thing about a campaign to line up all your elections is that it's not like clearly political, right? It's about getting out the vote, and making sure that there's a lot of voter turnout and that elections are representative and showing that regular people show up. Because honestly, regular people like housing. You left out of your story that even with no really effort, I don't know if there was other people making an effort, but your project, the rezoning only lost by 4 points. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it was at a first Tuesday in November election. Normal people were coming out, and if there had been even a little bit of organizing, like it may have tipped the scales for the housing.
Dan, as you indicated in your presentation, Westbrook has been very successful at attracting developers. What advice would you give to other city leaders not in Westbrook to help them attract developers?
Hire me. I'm just kidding. I do want to say something first about that. It's technically the first Tuesday after the first Monday, which complicates it more. And the reason why they have those is because it's the fiscal year, right? So they have to approve a budget. That's why you get those May, June meetings. But I don't disagree. It's confusing for a lot of people for what that's worth. My advice to communities, one, if you don't have the capacity to hire a qualified economic development practitioner, work with your regionals because they have professional staff that can help you sort of vet through what is real, what is garbage, what makes sense. And for what it's worth, it's clearly I was making a joke there, John, but we talk regularly with our colleagues. I know most of the ED directors around the state. I know Greg Mitchell, I saw him out there earlier. He's the ED in the city of Biddeford and has been doing it in the state for a long time. We talk regularly with each other. I get calls from other communities that don't have EDs, and we talk to them. I would not disagree with Sonia's comments or with Nathan's comments. There are some communities that have not embraced affordable housing, and I just want to be clear, something I learned from Nathan many years ago. When we talk about it, it's about people being on the lower end of a wage scale. They're the people that are working in our school systems. They're the people that are firefighters. They're the people that are even working at City Hall. They just want to be part of that community. And I think it's so important, something Sonia had said earlier, that's right, you shouldn't have neighborhoods that are poorer and richer. Do you know the city of Westbrook doesn't have any single family zoning? We're all about mixed use, and we're all about density, and we're all about mixed income. So when you can have someone make those statements locally, you can help drive some of that advocacy that you heard Sonia talking about and that you heard Elizabeth talking about. My only point is it doesn't always have to be top-down driven. But we locally do have a responsibility, right, to our communities, to our people, and to also deal with real housing issues that crop up.
In an instance where you have a town like Westbrook, which has proven to be very good at working with developers about getting housing built, about density, and there's other towns in that area, region, county, whatever it may be, that aren't as good about it. What role does the state play or does the county play in overseeing those things where it may impede something or overshadow something that you're already doing?
Yeah, the first thing I suggested to the Housing Committee, fund a state planning office. Because what happens then is you have different organizations. And guess what, people? Sometimes advocacy groups are misguided. Like you want people that have professional backgrounds that understand land use planning at that level. They can start at the top working through our regionals that can then work with us locally. Quite frankly, I don't even think we should just tackle it at the local level, John. I think we need to be tackling it regionally, because then we can get better sound policy. And do you know, I just stood in front of the Housing Committee a number of times over the last few weeks, and one of the things we gave up, we said, we'll commit city staff, if they're willing to form a committee over the summer months, to start dealing with drafting sound policy going into short session with the legislature. And then we can be advocates for other people that cause that tension with these other communities you're talking about. We're willing to put our money where our mouth is to help out with that.
Got it. Ken, I've got one for you, and this is a bit of a crystal ball question. In your presentation, you mentioned that interest rates of 7% or somewhere in that vicinity are here to stay. You've got these kind of two opposite forces pulling, where interest rates are going up, which creates downward pressure on home prices. But you also have this incredible amount of demand of people wanting to move to Maine, wanting to buy homes in Maine. When do you think that we'll start to see housing prices come down to a level at which they become attainable?
Yeah, so I think it's true nationally and true here in Maine. I think people who expect housing prices to come down, when you look at that chart I had in my presentation, where you saw the prices peak at 20% and then they've come down, and nationally it's about 5%. That's incredibly distorted by the national figures. So if you're in Charlotte or Atlanta or Austin, Texas, or San Francisco, the price collapse is pretty serious because it ran up so much higher. That's not the case here in Portland. It's not the case, the anecdote I gave you of my son looking to buy a house, I mentioned it was a hot real estate market. The market he's in is Buffalo, New York. I don't think people would qualify that as a hot market. So I think the supply shortage is, we had a lunch with some developers. The financial crisis of 08, 09 has created a shortage over a 10-year period that you're not going to fix in 2 years. It's just not going to happen. So I am not very optimistic that prices are going to suddenly, like they did in 08, 09, where you saw this 50% drop in prices and now everything was affordable. I don't think that's going to happen. On the interest rate front, I do believe that the Fed is done, and if they're not, they're pretty darn close. And so if Fed funds peak at 5.25, and as I said, it's a really interesting dichotomy in the marketplace. If you look at the Fed funds futures, they're calling for 3 rate cuts in the second half of 2023. The Fed is not suggesting that's the case at all. In fact, the Fed's language indicates there are going to be 0 rate cuts in 2023. So I think the worst of rate increases is behind us. They may go another 20 or 25 basis points, or maybe twice go to. But I don't think that the slowness in the economy, the impact on housing, the trend in inflation, and now the banking slowdown, I think all gives them an excuse to call a timeout. So I think the pricing aspect of housing, I don't see going away anytime soon. It's a 10-year shortage of houses that you just can't fix overnight. So I don't see that going away. And that's why my son is having such trouble with housing. And then secondly, the rate part, I think we're due. The other thing the other thing that the interest rate, the rate of increase in interest rates have created, and it's part of my son's list. So last Thursday, my son put in a $390,000 offer on a $365,000 listed house, and lost to 4 $400,000 cash bids. And what's happened in Buffalo, New York. So again, it's not Austin. But so I was curious about it, and where are all, because it's kind of an entry-level family, first kid house thing. And the answer is all these baby boomers downsizing, selling their big house with their 4 kids, no longer needing the 4-bedroom house, downsizing to this quaint little village, and paying cash with the equity that they sold their big house for, right? And I think that distorts the market, because it kind of, it screws up the kind of mechanism where you buy a house and you grow your family and then you move to the next one, you move up. But now you have these cash bids coming in on kind of entry-level things. And therefore, again, I think that's another dynamic. And then the last dynamic I would add is, who wants to move up and let that entry-level house become available when I have this entry-level house with a 3% mortgage. And you do the math and you say, okay, if I go from that $300,000 house to a $500,000 house, but my mortgage goes from 3 to 7, you're talking about over $1,000 increase in your monthly payment. So it's kind of locking in people, and I think it, particularly at that entry level, the prices are being impacted both from baby boomers downsizing and the people being locked in because of rates. The math is just really difficult to overcome. So I think it's going to be challenging. I think the rate part will help. Toll Brothers was on CNBC this morning saying they feel if you can get the mortgage rate down to around 5%, that will start to generate a lot more activity, because the penalty of giving up that 3% if it's 5 is obviously not as severe as if it's 7. So I'm optimistic on the rate side. The supply shortage and just the demographic dynamics of entry-level housing, I think will, in non-boom economies, I think it's here to stay,
So
unfortunately.
You've touched on the supply chain and the impact that has. You've touched on sort of the labor shortage thinning up after the 2008 financial crisis because fewer people were getting into the trades. What other macroeconomic trends do you think led us to this nationwide housing crisis?
Well, I think the excesses of 08, 09 clearly shocked the system. And then clearly COVID had just a major impact, both in good and bad ways, right? So we're talking about empty office space in major metro areas, and how do you rehab that? So that's a negative consequence of COVID. But a place like Portland with remote work was a beneficiary of all these people getting out of Boston because it was too expensive. I'm sure the same thing happened in San Francisco and LA, where you could move to smaller cities. So I think that dynamic changed. And then I think lastly, and I touched on this, and I could go on for hours talking about the whole push for infrastructure and climate change is going to suck up so much resource, whether it's commodities or labor, that it's going to impact the housing market because so much other activity is there. So I would highlight those 3 things.
In other words, if copper goes up by 4x, you can't build piping in a house because you can't afford it anymore.
You know, so if your peak copper in 2024, California wants to go to 100% EV cars by 2035. There are 33 million cars in California. And if an EV has 3 or 4 times the amount of copper than a combustion engine, where's the copper coming from? And I can't reconcile that. And every time I bring it up, people are like, well, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out. It's like, well, no, you got to figure it out, because developing a copper mine, so we're talking about NIMBYism in terms of housing and low-income housing, but it's also present when, if you go to build a copper mine, it's really problematic. And what I would emphasize, there's not a shortage of these materials in the world. It's just where they come from are problematic. So for example, copper, 40% of the world's supply comes from Peru and Chile. Both companies I would describe as politically unstable. 70% of the world's copper is smelted in China. Cobalt, 70% of the world's cobalt, which is big in any kind of EV type of production, comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I would suggest is not democratic or a republic, right? It's a dysfunctional country with all kinds of environmental issues because they're just not as clean. So I think that's what gives me pause when it comes to commodity prices. The COVID supply chain disruption is what caused the disruptions that's been mentioned a lot. But that, the Fed said it was temporary. It turned out to be a little bit longer lived than not. But it gives me pause when I think about all this activity and all this money being thrown at these big projects. The end result to me has got to be higher commodity prices.
Does anybody else have thoughts on the macroeconomic trends that we're seeing right now and how that's playing into the housing crisis?
Yeah, I want to talk more about the demographic thing that you mentioned. I think this is actually really important. I think that we're, for the first time, not only do we have 2 big generations, right? The boomers are a big generation, and so the millennials, their children, it's a lot of people. I think this is the first time in American history that both generations are competing for the same housing stock. Whether it's what you're talking about, somebody downsizing into a a smaller starter home, or actually what I see more often is boomers are living longer, better, and so they're not moving out of the houses that they raised their kids in.
Sonia, I also heard that they own 2 times the average number of single-family homes.
What do you mean?
Like, on average, they would have 1 house, but now they have 2 houses.
Oh, because they have a vacation home or something? That's nice for them. And I mean, and in previous generations, it was more normal to live with your parents. 3-generation households, but that cultural expectation has changed, so that's out the window. And then plus, for me, our parents' generation, they're so young and spry. They're like, it's great, 4 bedrooms, no problem. I'm still cleaning and maintaining. I love it. And so they're not freeing up that housing stock that they might have otherwise freed up. So then, when is this going to end? When boomers actually pass to the next life, which is like the youngest boomers are, I think, 60 or something. So we have another 30 years ahead of us.
Yeah, and I think nationally, I suspect it's probably similar here in Maine. Typically, new construction for single-family homes is about 10 or 20% of the total stock. It's over 30% now because you just can't find an existing startup home. So the younger generation is actually going to build new, which is not exactly the old, the old story either.
Yeah,
so
I don't think
there's a
we're
big
seeing
shift.
land fly off the shelf, too, because nobody knows what it's going to cost.
Right.
So it's kind of hard. I want to touch on more of the demographic. I think we're seeing a reaction from John's group of friends. You talk about it all the time. Nobody can find a place to live. They're
I'm
your
son's
age.
age.
Right?
There you go.
They can't find a place. It's a big part of this. The reaction that we've been seeing has caused the referendums, which is driving people to Westbrook from Portland. It's contributing to what your success you're seeing, I think. So when are we going to start seeing, do you think, and maybe you've seen it already, this like gut reaction, but it's not really a concerted, like proactive and intelligent reaction. It's more of an emotional reaction. Are you seeing that across the country? And what kind of like insight and precedents can you show us for like how to get people to see?
Yeah, well, I know that you're on a Discord group.
That's right.
Yeah, so you have to just become a chapter and give the action. Like that's what's driving, that's what's driving our growth, newspaper articles, books, everything like that. But yeah, trying to, channel it somewhere productive. Like the way that I got started, my friends and I, we would kind of rant to each other like, this is outrageous, like we need housing and people are proposing housing in San Francisco, and then people come and they oppose the new housing because they have a complaint about, their park or something. There's not enough parkland, so you can't build more housing. It's like very frustrating. And we were ranting to each other, and I was like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, no decision makers are here at this bar. We can go on Thursday afternoons to the Planning Commission. And I was like, you know what? Maybe nothing will happen, but we can give these great speeches in front of people who are about to make decisions. And I was like, oh, probably it won't work. But what we're doing now is definitely not working. And so it's just take that chance, that just if you try, something could happen. And actually quite a lot did happen. I mean, I'm here now. I was shocked.
Yeah. Dan, are you seeing anybody show up in your part of the world trying to change anything to something that you maybe think is not going to work?
Yes.
Activists, stuff
not too bad, but I just want to say something while you're on the demographics. Remember, not everyone who's a senior citizen has a lot of money. We also have a problem with being the oldest state in the nation, and we need a lot of affordable housing with seniors on fixed incomes who do not have an ability to earn more. This is about solving the problem, identifying it locally and regionally before you put a solution there. I think that is so important because we may have a bigger issue with, say, senior housing than 3 communities over. I think it needs to be local and regionally solved. And then you can start really supporting state-level policy to drive that. And you know who else I talk to? All of you out there. I talk to brokers on a regular basis. You know why? Because you have real live data on what's happening, right? And I talk to people like Nathan in the housing authorities because they know what the costs are. So that helps us drive our local policies, right? So we're not really experiencing groups in Westbrook. I'll be quite frank. Westbrook has been proactive. We have a very thoughtful, forward-thinking council, and they understand this. But part of that is they're at the street level, they're talking to people, and so you can see where the biggest disruption for us right now is all of a sudden we think we're doing things right, and then all of a sudden we get a big change. Now we have to adjust to that change. And then that may or may not be an issue moving forward. We're not experiencing that right now in Westbrook. As you can see, that I am certainly comfortable with conflict and dialogue. If you have a bunch of mini Daniels running around, you don't do good policy work. You also don't do good policy work in crisis. You need to be thoughtful because it has long-term impacts. And that is why I do think we need to get together, even with a local legislative body, to work really hard at making smart policy that helps with the timing, that helps with the costs, that helps really push local ordinances in favor of what the state's trying to push in, to support these things. But local advocacy, I think, is fantastic. We encourage more people to come up and have this conversation in the city of Westbrook.
I think one demographic issue, which I think is part of the issue of housing cost problems, is for some reason young people today are not going into the trades in the numbers that they used to 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. If you talk to general contractors, they'll tell you about the terrible problems they're having finding young people to work as plumbers, electricians, masons, roofers, framers, sheetrockers. And I think part of it is that as a society, there's been a lot of rhetoric about how everyone should be college ready. Everyone should go to college. And that there's something maybe that you haven't fulfilled your full potential if you go to a Voc school and get a job in the trades. And I think that's really a mistake. It's a mistake in terms of housing affordability, and it's a mistake for kids, because I think I'm like my two boys who are in their early 30s went to public high school, and a lot of their friends who might have gone into the trades some years earlier went to college and got degrees in things like anthropology and sociology, and just are not employable now. Whereas if they had learned to be a plumber or an electrician, they would be making very good money, much better money than they're making now, struggling working at a bookstore or being a barista, maybe living with their parents even though they're 30 years old. So I think as a society—
And not encumbered with student debt, too.
Right, exactly. Not to mention the student debt. So I think we have to rejigger that.
I can tell you why, though. Those jobs are dangerous. They break your body down. So if you're going to go into that kind of work, you have to think about, like, you may have to retire at 55 or 60 because you have broken your back. You know, is there going to be a public safety net for you? And, you know, you might not be making a lot of money working at a bookstore, but you also won't have some kind of repetitive stress injury or like a lung, problem. I mean, my mom was a registered nurse, which is a trade basically for women. And I know there are men out there, but and I wanted to be a nurse, and she said no. Because when she started, she had 8-hour shifts and she had a pretty good job. But as time passed, the hospitals consolidated, the working conditions got worse, the nurses get 12-hour shifts. It was just, the working conditions were just terrible. So, we have a lot of people like these guys, that are in the trades. Are they encouraging their own kids to get that job? Or are they saying, like, I'm working really hard and my body's breaking down and I need you to have something safer and healthier? So I think that's a big part of it. Like, we need to make sure that people are not getting injured on the job and they feel like it's going to be safe for them in the long term.
Do you think it's just safety, or do you think there's also some societal pressures to go and get a college education?
Oh, there's definitely societal pressure to get college education. I'm 40, and so I've had some reflection. I was like, what are intuitions I had as a teen that were totally right? And I remember as a teen, go to college. I was like, so what? We're going to have college-educated busboys? It doesn't make any sense. Yes, that completely happened. It is. It's, like, ridiculous. But I just don't think that's the major thing, because these 30-year-olds, they could get retrained today, but I'm sure they don't. Like, my husband worked an electrician for a long time. He left to found a robotic startup because he was sick of, like, coming home covered in drywall dust. Like, they are not good for you, those jobs. So I want to honor that.
Right, and so I agree with all that. I mean, my father was a policeman, but he was also an electrician, so as an 8-year-old, I was the one running through the crawl space, sticking the wires down the... So I know enough about electricity to be dangerous, and I'm really dangerous with electricity. So
I won't
maybe,
hire you.
maybe don't hire me. But what does that mean? So think about that in pure economic terms. If there's a shortage of electricians and few people want to go into the job, there's one way to fix it. The price goes up. You have to entice these people to say, okay, it's not worth it for me to go get dirty every day and have physical ailments because it's strenuous work, which is all true. But at some price, it's like, well, wait a second, that might be better. And
Well, it's getting there.
I think it's already there.
Yeah.
So I've talked a lot about my older son, but his buddy, who was on his lacrosse team, he's the goalie on the lacrosse team. Great kid, not a very good lacrosse goalie, but he immediately, right out of school, became a welder. I mean, talk about a skill that's going the way of the dinosaur. And he's making 150. I talked to him last week. He's making 150 grand with no debt, loves it, and not every So you're right, Sonia, that not everybody wants to be dirty and crawling through crawl space, but there's an equal number of people who don't want to sit at a desk. They think that's just as much of an anathema than being out pounding nails all day. But if there's that big of a shortage, and it kind of goes with my supply theme. The way that you fix a lack of supply is you raise the price of it.
I can tell you also, the good news is that AI is coming into effect. When it comes to building practices, we've been building the same way for the last 200, 400,000 years, and we're starting to think about it, and we live longer, but it is hard. I employ people who like to sit at desks and people who like to swing hammers, and they both have complaints, I'll tell you, because I hear them all.
Yeah.
So I think it would be nice for us as a community to try to curve the costs by figuring out how to build smarter inside, taking advantage of robots who couldn't do running. I mean, an 8-year-old was running wire because that's what your dad had you doing, but we could have a robot laying wire.
I'm pretty sure I grew up as a caddy, so I like to play golf, but I started caddying when I was 9 years old, and the president or the general manager of the golf club came to my brother and I, because we were hard workers, and he gave us $300. I want to say it was 1978, and he gave us a pair of snip pliers. Said, if you take all of these insulation things off these pipe and throw them in that garbage can, we'll give you $300. And we were like, yes. So I'm pretty sure I removed all the asbestos out of the room in 1978, but I can't be certain. But it's but I also think that college mentality it's beneath us, right? We won't do that work. And I agree with you that AI is going, and certainly when you look at real estate development, the plans that you have today are phenomenal relative to what they were even 10 years ago, right? So I do believe, but somebody's got to crawl in that crawl space and stick the wire in the hole. And so I don't see that need going away. And again, I just think it means that the cost of that labor, I have a hard time thinking it's going down anytime soon. I know that's not happy news for you, but I think it's the reality.
Yeah. We've got 16 minutes left up here. We've talked about demographics a lot, which is an important subject, but I want to make sure we have time for other things. Inclusionary zoning has become a really divisive policy, which it's been in Portland since 2015, and then strengthened, worsened in 2020 through citizen referendum. And we're seeing it now start to domino effect into other cities. So Biddeford is talking about it. Brunswick has a moratorium. Yarmouth is talking about it. And this is an open question for everyone on the panel. Do you think that inclusionary zoning is a effective way at making housing more affordable?
I can start. I think that it's a useful tool if it's done right, and if it's not overdone. So, for example, Portland began down that path. They passed 10 years ago or so, maybe 15. First inclusionary zoning was for any new construction, and I'm totally against imposing it on existing buildings because those owners have a whole financing structure that didn't contemplate that. But this was for new buildings, had to have 10% of the units affordable at rents that were affordable to households at 100% of the median or below. So that was pretty workable, and it did not deter development. But then by citizen-initiated referendum in 2020, that was increased from 10% to 25% of units, and the AMI, area median income requirement, went down from 100% to 80%. And what we've seen is the only large projects that are being done in Portland now are ones that were permitted or that got their planning board permit application in before this law change. No market rate developers are doing anything that's 10 units or more unless they have some special kind of financing, like it's a historic building and they can use historic investment tax credits. But for just ground up new construction, it's just not being done. And so basically the hand was overplayed in Portland. And so you have to be really careful about how you do inclusionary zoning.
So you talked about your capital stack and what goes into financing and development and the construction costs and what interest rates are and developers' risk insurance and a ton of other factors go into this formula, this recipe of yes or no, can this get built? And perhaps in a time when construction costs are low, maybe that 25-80% of AMI inclusionary zoning would work. Maybe, but we are in an ecosystem right now where construction prices are high, labor is hard to get, there's supply chain issues, and that whole formula is just creating a complete pause in development in Portland specifically. That's your opinion?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan triggers me because of all his local control stuff, but he's totally right that you gotta, like, inclusionary zoning is awesome, are you kidding? Living, people of different incomes living together, but the question is who's gonna pay for it? If you're gonna put all of the paying for it on the developer and not give any property tax breaks or fee breaks or anything, or even subsidy, then you're taxing new housing. And we tax things we don't want, right? You tax cigarette sales. Like, if you tax new housing, then you're gonna get less new housing, which honestly, for some proponents of inclusionary, that's the point. We've definitely seen in California exclusive cities with extremely high inclusionary rates. And the whole point is they pat themselves on the back. They're like, cool, we have a 20% inclusionary rate, so progressive, but also we have almost no multifamily zoning and nobody builds anything.
So they're NIMBYs masquerading as progressives.
It is a motivation, getting a policy across the line, it requires a coalition, and so, sometimes the coalitions have that in there. It's a way to look like you're doing something and also, not make building profitable, and so they love it.
I like that point about it. And in Portland specifically, where it only affects developments of 10 plus units. Really, what you're doing is you're taxing density.
Yeah.
In that instance, so we've seen quite a few 9-unit developments pop up in Portland since the passage of this new 2580 inclusionary zoning requirement.
And it's important to point out that was not the point. There were people out there who really genuinely thought it would help, and it's not.
Right.
It's quite catastrophic what it's doing, actually.
Right.
Yeah, and broadcasting that is really helpful. This is an industry group. Like, send out the press releases, make that the headline. I mean, it will motivate a reduction because that's what you're gonna have to do now.
I think a lot of progressive groups, the kinds of people who support very aggressive inclusionary zoning, don't understand that any new development, any bringing supply into the market for housing, even at the high end, benefits everybody.
Yeah.
As Ken was saying, I think earlier, that it's a market. It's an integrated market. So if an expensive rental unit is developed, someone's going to move into that. They're going to move out of another unit. That frees up that unit. That creates some play in the market. And so any kind of development, any kind of supply, is really, really helpful. And I would argue that just increasing our supply relentlessly is going to do more for housing affordability than all the inclusionary zoning you can possibly think of, because that tends to deter development.
Yeah, there's a German economist who did a study back in 2020 that found that a 1% increase in housing lowers rents by between 0.4 and 0.7%, which is on one of our slides for the
Yep.
introductory remarks. So in other words, if you have 10,000 homes and you increase it by 100 more homes, yep, it reduces rents by roughly 0.5%.
There you go.
Yeah, Evan Mast, who you mentioned in your first, and you can Google that, Upjohn Institute. He has a really good paper that really, he used change of address form data. You know, when you move and you fill out a form with the USPS, to see who moves and where the vacancies open up. And he found that creating 100 new units in an expensive neighborhood, he traced the chain of moves, like for 6 moves. It creates vacancies in the cheaper neighborhoods around, where that building is going. So that's another opportunity, actually, I think, for an industry group. I do think that developers and city managers, electeds, you can do more with trying to publicize that new development doesn't only create, however, the 100 new units that are created, but also some multiplier, because of this chain of moves effect, and even maybe be able to figure out, where those are.
Oh, sorry, Dan, go ahead.
I'll just say that we're a fan of mixed income and mixed housing. I think LIHTC deals you'll see too. You'll see market rate mixed in with subsidized housing, and the units look exactly the same.
So maybe you can speak, sorry.
Yeah, no, but I do want to say something though. It's okay to negotiate. The problem, so the Westbrook
think it's
City.
okay to negotiate.
Well, I'll tell you why it is, and I'll tell you how it works as a practitioner at the street level in a rural state like Maine. So when we use a lot of public subsidies. We have probably more affordable housing TIFs in Westbrook than most communities have. We have regular TIFs in there. Most of us understand how LIHTC deals work. So we have an example, right? So we have on Lincoln Street, market rate developer comes in, needs higher density. We had to rezone that district. We negotiated in a portion of those housing, 10% of those housing had to be affordable housing. That was part of the deal that was negotiated with them to get it. Because at the end of the day, I say this all the time, you can put any public policy you want in place to mandate what you're talking about, Portland overkill. How do I know that? The developers are coming to me, right? Come on, guys, right? So you have 10 units, everything's the same. You got to subsidize this one. That's what you were talking about, right? Without that subsidy, if you can't buy down that capital cost, you just can't make a policy because developers just don't do it. So it has the opposite effect. But what we're seeing is we have an opportunity to say, this deal over here I'm doing with you is a little different than the deal I'm doing with you. To your point, communities that don't do that and run and hide, then you're not getting an effect of what you should be doing. I still think we locally have a responsibility to deal with it. The policy in Westbrook is we'd rather incentivize developers to build affordable housing in mixed projects. And it's working. What I'm saying is it doesn't have to be one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Sonia, do you have anything to say?
No, that makes sense. I mean, you just got to pay for it. I love it.
We use a lot of subsidies too.
At the end of the day, it's a return on investment, and if you're going to force somebody to get less rent, for all very noble, it's a lower return on investment. You're going to get less of it. So Dan, you and I talked last night, and your point, somebody's got to pay for it, and if it's the developer who's being forced to pay for it, you don't get the development,
Yeah.
right? So it ultimately comes down to how, as a society, how do we do that? But if it's just going to come out of the developer's hide, the answer is going to be no thanks.
Or they'll just go to Westbrook.
Or they're going to
Right,
go the
where
next
you
phase.
actually have
Yeah.
a cool city manager.
Yeah, well, we are seeing a lot up at the state, and you're speaking about the housing committee up there, and Elizabeth is obviously pretty keyed into that, or Beth. There's a certain amount of money that they have allocated for the first time ever in the budget to deal with housing, so that's promising. I don't know if we have eyes on that yet. Dan, do you have anything?
Oh, I always have eyes on that. Yes, so from a public policy standpoint, right, a lot of ARPA money came in, right? 1.2 billion of that was earmarked towards bona fide economic development. If housing or affordable housing is one of your top 2 or 3 priorities, infrastructure is typically one of them, don't put 30 million at it, put 300 million at it. Now, Maine Housing can only process so much of that money, but that's okay, put a plan. So you know what? Take 40 million a year over some years. then developers like Nathan can then plan for that. Because what people don't know, those LIHTC deals are highly competitive. And some projects don't get funded, and developers have to put a lot of money in up front for that. So what I'm saying is more cash in the deal, the better if you are. It also allows you to get a little more creative with those dollars. So the answer is yes. It shouldn't just be all tax credits. Cash in the deal makes life a lot easier. Then you can also work with other creative ways. I've been approached by developers that want to do some more community housing projects, which is super cool. And then when they do some home ownership stuff for people that allows them to keep some of their equity when they are able to get out in the market and afford a home, it's just that takes time to get that policy working and that they're bankable. But the more money that's allocated towards affordable housing, then the state's saying we're putting some money up where our mouth is to support getting affordable housing built. So I think yes, those are important bills, and I think it takes a lot of broad shoulders and intestinal fortitude to drive that through legislature to make sure it happens.
I agree.
I like the word bankable because I was talking to a residential realtor the other day, and they were talking about when you build units, this is again going back to inclusionary zoning, if you build units to, let's say, 120% of AMI, and they come on the market, they're $450,000 or whatever dollars, you have to find the perfect buyer. And the buyer threads this Venn diagram of being wealthy enough to have enough money for the down payment, which if they're my age means they probably don't have student loans, they probably got a car from their parents, or they have a rich uncle, rich parent who gave them money for the down payment, but also poor enough that they qualify for that 120% of AMI. And it really reduces the number of people that are even eligible to buy the house in the first place. So there's been some developments which have come on the market which are at 120% of AMI or 100% or whatever it may be. And then they sit there for several months because they just can't find that buyer. This is less of a question and more just me.
No,
Jumping off.
You're venting.
it is.
Yeah.
I think it is a question. I mean, I'll tell you, like in California, or at least in San Francisco, I mean, people have just stopped doing ownership inclusionary, right? They always do the in-lieu fee because it is because of what you described. They cannot get rid of these units. And frankly, it's not a good deal for the buyer because it's not real ownership. And that's something a lot of people don't realize.
Because
Even
their equity is limited.
their equity is
That's
limited. You can't borrow against it. All these things you want to do. What do you want to do? Why do you want to have a house that you own? You want to renovate it? You can't in BMR ownership. You want to borrow against it to send your kid to school? You can't. You want to sell it for a lot of money because, you know, the neighborhood is suddenly hot? You can't. You want to move and rent it out? You can't. So it's not even ownership. And people actually will get very far in the process and even buy the place and not realize. So it tricks people. You know, in other countries, they just give or actually I've even heard of it here. There are some programs where some of these restrictions I talk about only last for 5 years or 10 years or something. That's a much better program. I think that if we really want to help people, we want to turn somebody who is asset poor, you know, into someone who is middle class. You have to just give them that housing.
Yeah.
So
I think it's called the Habitat for Humanity model, where you income restrict the first owner of the house, and then it's yours.
that's
So
great because
th-
that's real redistribution. You've really given somebody something and turned somebody who wasn't a homeowner into a real homeowner.
Yeah, and I'd imagine the competition to buy those is extreme because you buy it at whatever
Yeah.
$420,000, and the next day it's worth $600 or whatever the market dictates.
Right. That model, the Habitat model, though, requires sweat equity by the buyer. So that limits the pool a little bit.
In other words, they have to help build the house.
Habitat for Humanity requires that the first owner be, you know, out there swinging a hammer along with volunteers.
Could help train up
Try.
some tradespeople too.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a bad thing. Well, we can move to, if anybody here has questions or comments, and we're looking for people who genuinely have something to ask and not just a soapbox.
There's a microphone right here in the middle. Anyone, please feel free to come up. And like Shannon was saying, if you could try to keep your question brief and frame it as a question, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is John Smith with Great Falls Construction, and great. First off, nice job up there. Really thought-provoking and informational. But as you were talking about the labor shortage, I was literally twitching in my seat over there because you were dropping just so many just red meat comments about what's going on. And I do know you know, construction work can be challenging, but people are passionate about it and really do a great job of it. So the trick is to find those people. And I'm struggling to find a way to put this into a question, so I'm gonna make it really brief because I want to just talk about 2 examples. We have 65 employees at our company, and we do construction management, real estate development, and then we manage our own properties. So we're, you know, the way that we find employees is extremely challenging these days, and we could stand 30 more easily right now, as I know many of the other construction companies in the room would say the same thing. We try and pull them from many different sources. But one source that's really shut off for us and is a real challenge is the youth. And I think, Ken, you were talking about 8 years old, you were stuffing wires in a hole, and that's because you were a son, right? So you still could do that. And to some degree, I think parents might disregard some of the, you know, some of those laws a little bit right now. But we have, as an example, one of our longtime top-notch team members has a 15-year-old daughter that works on a farm, drives tractors, wears her hip boots, would probably take half the people in the room in an arm wrestling contest. And we're not allowed to hire her right now. We cannot hire her and put her on a job site. So these are real formative years for her.
Because of child labor laws?
Yeah, exactly. So what, you know, a year from now, when we can, does she still really want to? Right now, she says, Dad, I want to go to work. And we have a bring your kid to work day and things like that. And so that, you know, she comes for that. But we're not allowed to hire her. We have another engineer that we work with, works in a city, actually, that we've talked about a lot today, has a son who wants to work with us, 15 years old. We cannot hire him. And I know, you know, people are saying, geez, back off, John, let the kids be kids, right? But the reality is, I know 50-year-olds that should be nowhere near a power tool. And I know 15-year-olds that are very capable of training and learning. So I know that's only one sort of knob or lever on the labor pool, but I say it today just because there's a captive audience that understands the labor challenges. So sorry, I can't convert that to a question, but that's my comment.
No,
And
that's
great
good.
job. Thanks.
But thank you, John. And I think it's great to point out the Center of Technology in Biddeford and the one in Sanford are hugely successful. I don't know if there are others in the state that you know of.
Westbrook.
And you have one in Westbrook too? And is it successful? I mean, we're just seeing kids like say to their dad, I'm not going to an office job, I'm going to go be an electrician now.
I don't have the data to answer that question without the school department here, but I do know the numbers have been down.
They have been down? Oh, that's a bummer.
John, I forget where you went, but I'm speaking on something I don't know anything about here, but I would imagine that getting child labor laws repealed would be politically difficult.
No, they're not.
Oh.
Yeah, no, look it
Great.
up. Yeah, no, well, kind of. There's been a bunch of scandals, and so big companies like Nabisco and stuff, you know, they found young migrants, right, working, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, working all night at their factories, and then the response in those states was actually to relax child labor laws. It is related to, we've had strict immigration laws for a long time. You know, there's the labor shortage for a number of reasons, but one of them is that we're not letting adults come across the border. And so now, you know, more children are working. I mean, I started working as a dishwasher when I was 15, you know, and I was really into it. So remembering my childhood self, I'm like, yeah, let the kids work. But, you know, there's 2 reasons we have child labor laws. Well, there's 3. 1, we want kids to get educations. 2, they're small, you know, and so they're more prone to injury when working with tools and stuff that are ergonomically for adults. And 3, honestly, adults didn't want competition from children. I mean, that was a big reason to have mandatory schooler and child labor laws, was to increase wages for adults. So, you know, maybe we should have more immigration because at least adults are.
I think that's right. I think one of the reasons why we're experiencing such labor dysfunction is immigration. So when you look at the labor participation rate, there's basically 3 major categories that were impacted. In the heart of COVID, there was a 4th, which was women dropped out of the workforce. And that was largely a child care issue. And it was largely the schools were closed, so somebody had to stay home but the kids. And by and large, the women were the people who did it. That's largely reversed out since most of the schools were open. The second area we talked about earlier, which is the retirees. If you look at the 2 biggest assets of the average American, it's the home and it's their retirement account, 401k plan, IRA. Both of them skyrocketed in the middle of COVID. So a lot of them cashed out and said, why do I want to go into the heart of a COVID crisis, in a virus crisis? I'm going to retire early. Economists expected them to come back into the workforce. They have not. Apparently, retirement's a pretty good gig, right? But the third area that's still significantly below pre-COVID levels is immigration. And I want to be clear, I don't want to conflate illegal immigration, the border, with legal immigration. And so this became a hot topic in Syracuse recently because we've very fortunate had the benefit of Micron Technologies, big memory chip manufacturer, is going to open up a $20 billion plant just north of Syracuse. And upstate New York, because we have cheap power, hydropower from Niagara Falls, and some nuclear power, and it's right on the thruway, so it's right on I-90, really good place, and we happen to have some pretty good engineering schools. But Micron came in and said we could hire every engineering student in the state of New York for the next 20 years and still be 3,000 engineers short, right? So that's on the high end. So Micron is begging the government to allow HB1 visas for immigrant engineers. And primarily we're talking about Asia. But it's also the lower level. It's the introductory, the person who does the dishwashing, who works on as a laborer on the construction site. So in aggregate, we're about 3 million immigrants lower than we were and part of it was the federal government just shut down too. So they just weren't processing the applicants. And so when I look at that labor participation rate and why it's just now getting back to where it was, but it's still somewhat distorted, immigration is a big factor. And I sit here, Entenmann is German, my father was German and Italian, my mom's 100% Irish. I'm an immigrant. I'm a second generation immigrant, but I'm an immigrant, right? And so it's what made this, in fact, economically, immigration is one of the reasons why our country is so great, because most countries, think about Japan. Japan was going to take over the world in the 1970s, and it's been an economic wasteland for the last 30, 40 years. Closed society, no immigration, no foreign ownership. It's a death knell for our economy if you want to grow. And obviously in places where there is growth, like Portland, you need to increase your labor force, and immigration is a big part of that.
Two things that Maine's doing specifically. We passed a bill, I wish Elizabeth was still up on stage. We passed a bill that would give recent high school grads a chance to go to community college and major in one of the trades, and the state would pay for their schooling, which is just an awesome use of state funds. That's an ROI. And then we have asylum seekers who are basically waiting around to get to work on stuff. I think Collins and King co-signed on a bill that is in front of Congress right now, which would shorten the period for which those people are allowed to work down to 30 days or something to that realm. But I love both of those policies.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Do we have any other questions?
I guess we've done such a good job answering all the questions.
Oh, we got one in the back here.
I'll start. We had an ADU policy on the books already, so that we're already in compliance with short-term. No, well, I'm going to get to that. I'm tying them together, Nathan. So we had that. So we don't regulate short-term rentals in the city of Westbrook. So I'll start with that statement. So with that statement, we also had an ADU ordinance in the books. So we knew one of three things were going to happen, right? We talked about it. Sometimes your kids come back to live with you. You brought up a point. Sometimes they come back with or without a kitchen. They're coming back, right? But sometimes you get your mums and your dads. Sometimes you got to help them out too. They're coming back too as well. But then there are sometimes people that they got to buy down their own mortgages because it's expensive. So they'll Airbnb them. We actually understand that and say, you know what? If you're using ADUs as a tool to say it's just going to deal with affordable housing, be careful. If you're using ADUs and leaving it open and not managing them like that, it allows people a lot of flexibility on how they want to use their ADUs. And so the short answer is we just don't regulate short-term housing in the city of Westbrook.
Amazing. Yeah, I think it's obvious that ADUs take up housing. I mean, we know they do. You go to one and it's, yeah, sorry.
Excuse me,
I'm so sorry.
short-term-
So glad that you're here.
Short-term rentals. That's right, Nathan.
Yeah, short-term rentals, they obviously cannibalize housing, which is, more is more, basically. It's another reason to add more housing because some of it used to be, I guess, that towns were like, cool, we know that this is a hotel and this is definitely a house. Well, it turns out that those are merged now. It's kind of a gray area. Hotels actually can also become residential. I mean, that's what an SRO is. So it's just sort of one big category that's sort of mixed together now.
So what do you mean when you say more is more?
It's another motivation for adding units. You might add an apartment building. Look, you'd love for all 100 to be not short-term rentals, but maybe 20 of them are going to be, so then you get 80, so then make it a bigger apartment building. It's just like another reason. Something that's a little bit similar is sometimes comes up, I don't know if it comes up here, definitely, we've seen it in the West Coast, is that people will complain, oh, you're building these new condos, but they're going to be second homes. Or they're just investment or something. People aren't going to live there. And then I think of somewhere like Miami. Miami has fully embraced that part of what its local economy runs on are condos that are second homes. Like that can be a thing you produce, like apples or oranges. It's not actually so bad for a city, right? Because you get all of that property tax revenue and you don't even have to provide services for most of the year. And I mean, basically, if it's a high rise, you're turning like empty air into something that's just printing money for your city. It's a good opportunity if you can take it. So I don't know. I just don't think people should get super fixated on like what's gonna happen. Like, oh, somebody's gonna build this ADU and it's really just gonna be for, a short-term rental, and so we shouldn't even bother. That ADU will be there for a long time.
So you don't think cities should try to limit the number of short-term rentals?
I don't know if they should or shouldn't, because there are other reasons besides it distorting the housing market that cities want to regulate short-term rentals. I mean, for the whole reason of not having hotels in neighborhoods in the first place, sometimes neighbors get mad about it. Like, they don't want all that traffic, particularly in apartment buildings where they feel like it creates a security risk, where a small apartment building, everyone, except actually one of the units is strangers coming in all the time. So I think there's a response to that can be not unreasonable.
If I can add too, so in Portland you have roughly 1,000 STRs. We need about 18,000 houses in Portland to match up with demand.
What are STRs?
Short-term rentals, excuse me, Airbnbs. So if you said Airbnbs are illegal in Portland, all of a sudden Portland gets flooded with 900 or so new units, which can be occupied by long-term tenants. Would it help? Yes. Is it? It's the cranberry sauce though, and building more housing. That's the turkey, the gravy, and the mashed potatoes. So people tend to get fixated on this city. It always comes up during referendum elections. But really, the bigger thing we need, if we're going to really fix this housing crisis, is building more housing. A lot more housing. I think you lost your mic, by the way.
Probably just battery dead or something.
Another thing too, short-term rentals, I don't know, is so like in New York, for instance, there are a lot of basement apartments. And they also have this, short-term rental, anxiety. It actually it would be good for the basement apartments. Many of them are short-term rentals. It seems like the right way to use them because they're not such great apartments for.
Yeah, and if you have young people who want to buy a house and start getting equity, if there's a 2-unit where one of the units is that basement, and that's how you justify the monthly payment as Airbnb-ing it out, supplementing the mortgage.
Yeah, that's one of the ways. That's how we can tell that obviously though, like this practice, if you're in a place where it makes sense, a vacation place like Portland or even New York, of course it props up prices, right? Because you have people who are like, well, my income would let me buy, afford this much, but then maybe I'll add and I'll do this short-term rental thing. So it props up prices. It makes things more expensive. So if anybody says to you, I think that Airbnb makes things more expensive, yes, we know for sure it does.
Sonia, have you ever heard of a policy where municipalities have a set number of short-term rental licenses they dole out, and they only give them to new construction? So in other words, we
Wow,
only have
that's
500, but if
Wow.
you build something new, you can use it as an STR for the first 10 years, and then it converts to long term.
I haven't heard of that.
Okay.
I don't know if people would like it, but maybe they will.
Have you heard of that, John?
Liz Trice, who, what's the name of the development company that was doing the co-op on Douglas Street?
Maine Community,
Chum?
Maine,
Was it Chum?
It wasn't John.
Maine
it was-
Cooperative Development.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Liz Trice is with that organization, and I had a Zoom call. Ben Brennan and I had a Zoom call with her a month or so ago, and she had a laundry list of ideas, and that was one of them. I thought, that's interesting.
Well, John, who here knows what our number one economic engine is? Number
Tourism.
one. Tourism. There's your answer. And,
Yeah.
and that's all over the state of Maine. It can provide additional income for people, and it does put more units on the market. That's part of the reason why we don't regulate in the city of Westport.
Nice.
That's great.
We've got about 2 minutes left. I think everyone's already gotten their continuing education credits.
That's
Any
one
final
more
quick
question,
questions?
I have a quick question. Matt Pouliot, State Senator, Republican lead on the Housing Committee. I'm wondering, curious, with 5% of the production of housing offsite currently in the United States, what role do you think offsite construction plays in solving the housing crisis?
Manufactured housing. I was just on a panel about manufactured housing. So I learned something. First of all, what a lot of people call mobile homes, they call it manufactured housing nowadays. And manufactured housing is, it's anything, that's built off-site, and then you truck it to where it goes. And then most of the time, it's actually stapled to the ground one way or another, and you cannot tell the difference. It can be multi-story. You can have a 3-story manufactured housing.
You can have apartment buildings, 8, 9, 10 stories with modules that are just stacked on each other.
So the modules, it didn't work out. What we found, because it was real trendy a few years ago, at least in the Bay Area, and what people found was that putting it together, so there's kind of 3 things. One, like bespoke, fully built where you are, and then there's like the manufactured housing, which is like basically the whole house just on a truck. It has an I-beam that runs underneath it, and so it can only be so wide. And then this thing in the middle, which is this modular thing, but it wound up being very complicated it's not cool like Legos, and everything has to be super perfect. Like there's no give, because you have to have these panels matching up, and like if one hole for electricity and, the other one is up here 6 inches, it's all messed up. So that was a lot more difficult than people thought it was going to be.
Can I add to that too? Senator Pouliot, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
I mean that. You're genuinely thoughtful on the Housing Committee, and you listen very well. We really appreciate your comments. 2 things. Does manufactured housing appreciate or depreciate in value?
It appreciates because it's all in the land. Nobody cares about the house.
We do. The other thing is, that's part of the problem. You're right, because it's how, that was a smart aleck response, but the bottom
No,
line
it's a
is,
true response.
it depends how it's set up. Some people own the land underneath it in Maine, and some people don't. They rent. But either way, and it's an investment in housing that, you're right, that depreciates in value, and that some people own them, but they don't own the land underneath it. So therefore,
That's a bad deal for sure.
So you're talking about mobile home parks.
manufacturing
but-
parks, but
there's also modular construction,
And that's
which I
what it's
think is
gonna
part
go-
of Senator Pouliot's question.
And that's what I was going to go to next. There's a lot of work done on building science right now. And there's a lot of great stuff out there now on modular homes that come in that work fantastic. They're efficient. You can bring them in, you can get them up quickly.
Yeah.
And that really helps with the quickness of getting housing built. So they're all still stick built. They just come in and set and spot. So I just wanted to distinguish for those who didn't know that's where part of the issues come between the difference between manufacturing and, say, modularized.
And I think that one of the benefits of off-site construction is when you're building in a factory, it deals with some of the issues that
Yeah.
Sonia was talking about the dangerous conditions of working in construction. Because it's climate controlled, you're out of the snow and ice, you can have negative pressure in the building, so it's sucking dust out while you're working. So there's a
And
lot
it's
of
just
benefits.
warm
that
and
way.
you don't have to take your gloves off,
Right.
right? You don't have to worry
Right.
about that.
Yeah, you're not like stuck working at night for some reason or early in the morning or, yeah.
All right, so Craig's given us the roundup. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for being here. And
For
I thought
having
we were
us.
maybe going to see a little bit more drama, but everybody kept it pretty cool. so-
Yeah.
Thank you.
And if y'all could hang on for just one more minute, a couple of reminders. One, as Britt said, where are you, Britt? Stand up. What do we want to do? Get out and vote. Shelley's here somewhere. Shelley would say, fill out the evaluation forms, please. I'm sure Kim Twitchell and Mark are still here. I want to thank MBT Bank and Sebago Engineering for all their support. I'd like to thank Headlight Audio Visual, Andy Bruns, for all you guys do. The sound here has been great. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Shannon and John. You guys are awesome. Put really a great show together. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. I think it's been a great day. Matt Pouliot, you're the man. You're doing a lot in Augusta, and you're hearing it from a lot of people and a lot of sources. Check this guy out if you don't know him. He's doing a lot for us. And a final reminder, complete your membership survey. And if you're not a member, why not? Be a member. Look at this. This is awesome. Anyways, go enjoy your day. Have a good day.